Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Free Palestine Melbourne, Demilitarise, RMIT, and Jewish Council Australia, I would like to welcome you this evening to our forum, Denial in a Time of Genocide. Our forum will highlight and explore the important aspects of this topic, the denial of the Palestinian people's story of suffering and their fight for freedom and self-determination, the denial of their right to live on their land with dignity, security, and prosperity. First, allow me to respectfully acknowledge the owners of the land where we are gathering this evening, the Wurundjeri, Woi-wurrung, and Bunurong, Boon-wurrung peoples of Kulin Nation, and I pay respect to their elders, past and present. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The denial is not only a matter of historical grievance, but also a current reality that affects millions of lives. While we confront a painful reality, a genocide, a deliberate and systematic destruction of the Palestinian people's society is often accompanied by an equally insidious force. Denial can manifest in various forms, from the outright denial of historical events to the minimization of their impact. It can come from those who wish to obscure the truth, or from those who, overwhelmed by the enormity of the atrocities, seek to distance themselves from the horrors. This evening, our distinguished experts will guide us through this important discussion during the time of genocide. It's my great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our esteemed expert, Professor Saree Makdisi. Give him a warm welcome. Professor Saree Makdisi is a professor of English and comparative literature at the University of California. His books include Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial, Palestine Inside Out, and Making England Western. He is a frequent contributor to the Nation and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Please give him another warm welcome. Professor Saree, we are incredibly fortunate to have you with us tonight. So thank you for accepting the invitation.
Thank you.
Your book was published in 2022. It's never too late to congratulate you for the publication. Your book, Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial. You have made us, as a Palestinian and as a Palestinian, more conscious about what we have been experiencing since 1948, since the Nakba. And you made the pro-Palestine supporters and others more aware of how what so-called democratic states are complicit in the denial and in the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people in general and in Gaza in particular. Also, I would like to introduce our remarkable expert, Louise Adler. Louise Adler is director of Adelaide Writers Week and a member of the Jewish Council of Australia's Advisory Committee. She has spent over 30 years in the publishing industry, including as CEO of Melbourne University Publishing and as publisher at large of Hachette Australia. Her board roles in the creative industries include the president of the Australian Publishers Association, chair of the Prime Minister's Literary Awards, chair of the Victorian Government's Creative Victoria Strategy Task Force, and for over a decade serving as a board member of the Melbourne International Arts Festival board and the Australian Centre of Contemporary Art. We are grateful to have you leading this conversation tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to run you through this, the run sheet tonight. So we planning to have 1 hour conversation. So that, or about, and then about 45 minutes Q&A. We apologize because we couldn't actually secure the book to be delivered on time. Otherwise, we will have a book sign at the end of the forum. But if you want a copy of Professor Saree's book, please contact Free Palestine Melbourne, and soon you will have the book available in our stall in Sunday Raleigh. After we finish, actually, we will have Aviva from Jewish Council Australia to give us a small speech, and then Tammy and anyone from Demilitarise RMIT, and then we close and go home. So now I will leave our expert to start their conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So because I've spent a long time, all my working life in the book business, I've propped up the book, which is what we do in publishing. So I feel a bit guilty because it's a sort of provocation. But I do hope, publishers, we want you to buy the books. I cannot believe that the distributors here have failed yet again, but I love them. But nevertheless, please order the book. It's very important. The royalties notwithstanding, it's a very important piece of work. I thought it was remarkable. I must say, Mayad has stolen my introduction, so I won't rehearse the details of Saree's illustrious career as an academic. But I'm not an expert, and I'm not here in my role as director of Writers' Week, and I'm sure we all understand the politics around this in this current moment. And I'm here in a personal capacity because I've long been committed as a non-expert, but someone who thinks this is an issue. It's not because I'm Jewish, it's because I'm a human being that I think this issue is so important. I'm also here because I couldn't wait for the opportunity to talk to someone from a Department of English and Comparative Literature, which is where I come from and where I had all my academic training. And there are not enough of us around anymore, and it's just a thrill. So because I've had that sort of training, if you like, I'm, I think in polite terms one would say conscientious. So I have about 98 questions, and it's a thorough grilling of Saree and the book in all the details, and so I hope he will pander to me because I think it's really interesting. It's not just that it's interesting, it's important, but and I didn't find a better way to describe why I found it such rich reading. It's a series of case studies that illuminate what it has meant, what the Nakba has meant, what the kind of the Zionist project has meant. So it's in the detail that I think is really interesting. So I'm hoping that Saree, I think you've got notes, or no, you don't need notes. You know this story. You know this story, so he's probably got an email from someone,
I was turning up my phone.
Turning off your phone. All right, it's okay. That's right. So, so I've got to take Saree through the argument, through these they're more than vignettes, they're very detailed and micro stories, if you like, that prove the argument that he has. And I very much appreciate the way he's conceived of this argument he will make, which we will explore in detail. And I don't know how many of you have had the chance to read Nathan Thrall's book, A Day in the Life of Abd Salama, but it reminded me of the importance and as a person who's edited books, I appreciate the detail in the intense examination in detail of particular moments in history or particular sites of conflict, that are rich with explaining the issue that we now confront. And I thought that Nathan did that superbly in that account of One Day in the Life of Abd Salama, and I think that Saree is doing this in this project too. And we'll go through some of those examples in a moment. So I wanted to begin by asking you about the focus, if you could put it like this, that your understanding of the double strategy of the Zionist project to affirm and to deny, to affirm the legitimacy of the State of Israel while also denying the existence of Palestinians. I think it's a narrative of distraction in a way. Look over here, don't look over here. But that's my inexpert opinion. Don't look at the destruction of Palestinian villages, for example. Best we should look at how the desert bloomed with the Zionist project. So I wanted to ask you to begin by telling us why you describe that as positive denial.
Thank you, Louise, and thanks to all of you for coming. And I should say also, by the way, I'm not an expert either. I am a professor of English and comparative literature, and obviously we're not talking about English or comparative literature here. So, but the question that you're asking, Louise, is an important one, because actually what I say in the book is that there are different kinds of Zionism. So there's a Zionism that is perfectly comfortable in saying, in a blunt way, that we need to eliminate the Palestinian people, that they need to be gotten rid of, that, you know, then they make no bones, you know, as to what they're actually about. People, I mean, today it's people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they're sort of mercifully blunt, and I would even say honest, really, in some sense. They just say what they want to get rid of people, and that's it. The mission of the book was to understand the other kind of Zionists, the ones that in an American idiom we would call liberal Zionist, although I know that term works differently here. So let's say progressive Zionist. Because many of you probably know this, but Zionism had its basis of support literally for decades was on the left, not so much on the right? So it was the Democratic Party in the US or the Labour Party in Britain or much of the French left all through the 1960s and 70s, people like Sartre and de Beauvoir and Foucault and people like that. Derrida and so on, right? So I wanted to know how could it, and this is kind of the question the book asks, how could it be that somebody can commit themselves on the one hand to a progressive politics, on the other hand to Zionism, because as far as I'm concerned, Zionism is inimical, like it's a contradiction.
Yep.
Either you support human rights and equality and justice and, you know, liberation, which is what I think the left stands for. That's my understanding of the left. Or you support apartheid and home demolition and ethnic cleansing, and these are irreconcilable ultimately. So what I'm interested in, what the book is interested in is are the modes of denial that progressive Zionists work themselves into or work through in order to be able to reconcile these contradictions, which brings us to the sort of positive affirmation of denial. What I say is there are different kinds of denial, right? So there's the kind of denial that says, for example, the Palestinians don't exist, or the 1948 Nakba didn't happen, or today it's not a genocide. There's a kind of negation, right? But that's very, very hard, I say, to build a kind of a sense of inhabiting a progressive political culture. So my argument is that what people on the progressive spectrum of Zionism, what they need to do is to affirm something positive. They want to be able to attach themselves in a positive way to something in Zionism. So let's give an example. As I think is pretty well established by now, the Israeli state is an apartheid state. It was just sort of, you know, not emotionally speaking, juridically, institutionally, legally. We can go into all the details, as much detail as anybody wants and more, in fact. And this is widely established not only by reports by organizations like Amnesty International, but in a recent advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So there's no contention about this. But a progressive Zionist, of course, can't admit that because then they're contradicting themselves. So what we hear progressive Zionists do is they assert the value of Israel as what they call a Jewish and democratic state. So rather than saying no, Israel is not an apartheid state, which is a negative assertion. They state the positive. Israel is a wonderful Jewish and democratic state. It treats all of its citizens equally. And these things are not true. And in fact, the very formula, Jewish and democratic
Yes.
state, is actually an oxymoron.
An oxymoron.
Right? But they don't even notice. But it's through this positive hyperbolic affirmation of a positive value that they're able to transact the denial of the Palestinian presence and of the reality of what the Zionist project in Palestine is actually all about. And I can go into more examples if you want, but I don't know.
We'll go there slowly, but
Okay,
gradually.
fine, okay.
So after October 7, you say that positive denial has turned into a negative denial, and
Yeah.
I wondered if you could
Yeah.
tease that out for us a little.
Yeah, and in fact, the point you made, Louise, is also very important. So the part of the way the positive denial works is by saying, as you said, don't look over there at the apartheid, look over here at the Jewish democracy. So don't notice the thing that we're trying to make go away. Let's focus on the thing that we want to valorize and celebrate so much that with all of this fanfare, we don't see the thing that's being occluded and hidden and made to disappear. So October 7th is interesting because it's actually the same structure but kind of flipped around in the way that if you notice how the attention that's constantly being drawn to the events of October 7th in mainstream media accounts, it's always, you may have seen this, it's always the same formula. Everything was fine, there was peace, October 6th it was beautiful, there was the Nova rave party, everything was fine. And then out of the clear blue sky, Hamas, you know the formula by now, right? Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th and killed, now the number that they've left, 1,200 civilians. And then they just recycle that formula over and over and over again, and then we get a litany of disasters of what happened on October 7th, which is not to say that horrible things didn't happen on October 7th, but they did. But the point is, the constant drawing attention to October 7th accomplishes two things at once. It's the same structure of look over here, don't look over there. So look over here, let's focus on October 7th, and therefore we're not going to see two things simultaneously. One thing we're not going to see is everything that led up to October 7th, the previous 75 years of dispossession and home demolition and execution and torture and confiscation and ethnic cleansing and you know the whole thing, right? So none of that happened. It's like none of that is like that's all gone. It's banished by focusing on October 7th. So look over here, don't look over there. And of course the second thing that the attention to October 7th accomplishes is everything that's happened since October 7th, which is now basically 11 months at this point, of what we now know to be, without any question, a genocide. Right? So focusing obsessively on October 7th helps to make it impossible to recognize either the context out of which October 7th emerged, 75 years of dispossession, occupation, and apartheid, and a kind of creeping, slow, day-by-day genocide, not like what's happening in Gaza, which is large scale, quantitatively much bigger, but this sort of slow creeping day by day, drip by drip, Dickens says somewhere, if you want a literary reference, it's like being stung to death by individual bees or drowning by droplets. That's how Israel has functioned for 75 years of torture and abuse. So don't look over there, look over here. To give an example of this, I read an article today in the Los Angeles Times, which was about how, according to this author, Jewish people are being forced out of the Democratic Party in the US, which used to be their home. And the article is all about, this is written literally 2 days ago, it's all about October 7th was the worst calamity to befall Jewish people since the Holocaust. And let's talk about how where Jewish people fit in the American political system. They're alienated by what the author calls anti-Israel demonstrations. They're alienated by how they wrap their minds around this, I don't know. But the anti-Israel stance of the Democratic Party, which I don't understand because the Democratic Party has been funding a genocide for 11 months, right? Israel has dropped 80,000 tons of explosives in Gaza. The US, under a Democratic administration, has shipped 50,000 tons of explosives.
And just signed off another $30 billion worth of arms.
Billions and billions and billions and billions. So but the point is, the recurring motif of the article is the tragedy that befell the Jewish people on October 7th. as I said, what the article says is the worst thing that's happened to the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And these are not even, first of all, you can't even compare October 7th to the Holocaust. Secondly, the Holocaust is something that took place in Europe under circumstances of European anti-Semitism, which goes back centuries and culminated obviously in the Holocaust. But what the article does not mention, not even in passing, not even a reference, forget the word genocide. It is as though nothing has happened in Gaza for the previous 11 months. There's no mention of Gaza at all. So look at that, right? Let's look over here obsessively at October 7th, the worst calamity to the Jewish people since the Holocaust, according to this article, and let's not even mention it's like this whole calamity of, we now know it's not 40,000 people who've been killed, it's 190,000 people, according to the Lancet, who've been killed. Two-thirds of the housing in Gaza destroyed, the hospitals, the universities, the very basis for life totally eradicated by American taxpayers, but financed primarily by American taxpayers, including the author of this article. But no mention at all is made of this thing, for which we as Americans are responsible. And it's it's mind-boggling to me. This article would have been bad enough if it was published in November 2023. It's published literally 2 days ago, as though this Holocaust is not happening. Like it completely disappears because of the obsessive focus on October 7th. So that's how, but you see how it's the same kind of structure. Don't look over there, look over here. The positive version of it is, let's look at how Israel makes the desert bloom, so we don't see everything else that it's doing. Israel is this wonderful democracy that treats all of its citizens equally, which it doesn't. But let's focus on that rather than what it's actually doing. Israel is a place, it's a place where gay people can feel welcome and so forth, which is also not exactly true, but it also covers up all of the forms of repression and violence and homophobia, among other things, that Israel partakes in. And so this structure of distraction, whose main function is to let a progressive, in American political context, a democratic supporter of the Democratic Party feel good about themselves as in terms of their progressive consciousness, with no sense of what it is that they're supporting or endorsing in their support for this project.
I find the strategy, the political strategy, the textual strategy of a piece like that really interesting. I mean, it's clear. It's it's very important to decontextualize, to erase, or to kind of certainly not to mention a prehistory. I mean, however you want to describe the preceding 75 years. But the political tactic of it and the relentlessness and the assiduousness of the strategy to the October 7th, nothing happened before, and this is the worst thing that's happened to Jewish people since the Holocaust, and always the elision and the conflation of the two. If we invoke the Holocaust, then what happens to us is unique, and it was without well, it's not without parallel. I shouldn't even say it's without parallel. However, that elision of this Holocaust, what it signals. So, in terms of the language of the Democratic Party, the progressives, Jewish progressives, for example, you had Peter Beinart on your program, is a dear colleague of mine, on the Makdisi Street podcast, which I'm assuming you all listen to. It's absolutely fabulous, and it's very important to listen to. But it's very interesting the way that Jewish progressives in the States are navigating this problem, and I wondered if you talk about the language, the political language that's used.
Yeah, that's very important, because what's interesting about the contemporary situation in the U.S., and I don't know enough about Australia to speak to it, but I assume something similar is happening.
Exactly the same.
Here.
And the Labor, just to assure you, or not reassure you, the Labor Party in Australia has long been Semitophiles, and deeply going back to Bob Hawke. I wouldn't know if it's any further than that, but certainly in my my political consciousness, it's certainly been, the Labor Party has been so strongly in support of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, the thing is,
sentimental even about it. I mean, it's
right.
extraordinary.
As is the case, as had been the case in the U.S.
Yeah. Anyway,
what's interesting is that the U.S. is changing very, very rapidly, and there's a crisis on I hesitate to call it the Democratic Party the left-wing party, but what passes for the left-wing party in the U.S. So there's a crisis in the Democratic Party itself, which culminated with what we saw recently with the removal of the person that I'm not by any means a fan of Joe Biden, as you can imagine. I never have been, but there was a political process by which the members of the party had effectively nominated him, all but nominated him through millions of people voting, and suddenly he's picked up and he's deposed, and now somebody else is going to be the party's candidate, which is an extraordinary thing if you think about it. And it's because of Palestine, because he was too sullied. It wasn't just questions of is he up to the job and so on, but it was also because of Palestine that was dragging the Democratic Party backwards in polls and so forth. So there's very much a sense that the Democratic Party, in other words, the so-called left in the US, is split over the question of Palestine. Similarly with the question of a big constituency on the American left, which is the Jewish left. Very, very badly split. So there's all this talk about Jewish people want this, or for example, when it comes to a university context, Jewish students are afraid, or Jewish students feel uncomfortable. It's like, well, which Jewish students? The Jewish.
And what does being afraid mean?
And what does being afraid mean?
mean?
Exactly.
I mean, really.
Exactly.
Anyway,
right. So there are gigantic rifts within the progressive Jewish community in the U.S. and hence on the left as well, the Democratic left as well. And it's no longer the case that one can take for granted. Not that one could ever really take for granted, because there were always Jewish leftist people like Chomsky and so forth who were always critical of Zionism. But I mean, now it's much more. It's much more fluid. There's no such thing any longer. One can't speak of a Jewish left Zionist position and take it for granted. It's fractured. It's not. It's simply not there anymore. Especially in the context of universities, which I assume we're going to get to in a little bit. So I'll save that for later. But that's where we can most see that split in play. It can no longer be taken for granted. Not that it ever could, but certainly not now.
We used to, people, like me on the Jewish left would say, there were 12 of us who were, anti-Zionist in Australia. I think we're now 36. No, more. I mean, we were talking, I'm a pessimist, he's an optimist. We'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, whatever. So I wanted to take you to some of the detail in the book, the vignettes or the case studies. I thought, you talk about Yad Vashem, you talk about the Museum of Tolerance, the JNF tree planting exercise, the Eurovision Song Contest, the gayfication of Tel Aviv. And I wanted to start with the JNF project because I haven't thought about the JNF project for years. For some reason, my family, I don't know whether my friend Sivan's family had a JNF box, but I couldn't go into another Jewish family's home. We did not have one, but my parents were, two of 12 serious leftists. Actual leftists, right? We would never have had a JNF box, but there was not a Jewish community. I think there would not have been a Jewish family.
Tell people, just in case, what is a JNF?
Yeah, the JNF box
I know what it is.
We know. So it's a little blue box with the Star of David on it, and I don't know what you're supposed to put, your pocket money in there. Here it was to reassert at every turn. You'd have it in your kitchen or in your lounge or wherever, I don't even know where, but whatever. And it was to donate to the exercise of planting trees in Israel. So I don't think there would have been a Jewish family that would not have had one of those boxes. So the ties, the building of a relationship between the diaspora and the Jewish diaspora's relationship to the state of Israel is so dense and consistent, relentless. At every turn, this is how you connect. And every time I would do a speech in the old days to the Jewish community, my misfortune would be to give them a certificate that had, we'll plant a tree in your honor in Israel. And I would think, perhaps not. Well, I think maybe plant a tree in Australia would be better for me. A eucalyptus tree, which of course we imported to Israel. Yeah. So let's talk about the origins of the JNF tree planting exercise in Israel, much more important.
I mean, it works just as Louise was saying. The way it works is progressive Jewish constituencies around the world were offered, why don't you support this wonderful project? Because what does Israel represent after all, right? Israel, at least this is the narrative that's being presented. Israel represents making the desert bloom, right? Where Palestine was this empty wasteland of howling winds and rolling dust balls and things like that. There weren't people there, of course, according to this narrative, right? And so it having been a desert for 2,000 years, etc., what does the Jewish state of Israel represent? It represents the greenification of the desert, making the desert bloom. And of course, that's sort of captured in the project of planting trees. So the main organization, not the only, but the main organization responsible for this tree planting endeavor is the Jewish National Fund, which predates the state of Israel, but it has sort of parastatal status now. And so the Jewish National Fund gathered lots of money from progressive, left-leaning, environmentally conscious Jewish people around the world, not only Jewish people, but of course primarily Jewish people, to donate money to plant trees in Israel. And they tell you on their website, because now I don't know if there are boxes, but there's a website and the website says plant a tree in Israel, and you can give $1 or $10 or whatever, probably more than that too, to plant a tree. And so what they do tell you is that Israel has planted more trees than any other country in the history of the universe, they say. They've planted, I think they've said something like 250 million trees, which is a hell of a lot of trees. What they don't tell you, like this footnote there, is that most of them die, but that's another story. And we'll actually get to why they die in a second. But they have planted a lot of trees. What they do not tell you is where they are planting the trees. So where they're planting the trees is over the ruins of Palestinian villages that were demolished after the Nakba of 1940, during and after the Nakba of 1948. So during the Nakba, 800,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes, and they left behind, of course, having been driven from their homes meaning 500 or so villages, towns and villages, that were systematically, after 1948, and it took many years, by the way, the Israeli state demolished these villages one by one. They bulldozed them, they dynamited them, they bombed them, they just made them go away. And of course, that left a landscape of ruin. And so what they did is they planted forest over the ruins to make the ruins disappear. So in trying to reach out to a global progressive constituency, they wouldn't say, give us money so we can plant forests to make these horrible ruins disappear so we can cover up the traces of ethnic cleansing in which we've engaged. They would say, give us money so we can plant trees to make the desert bloom. So you're a good progressive person. Well, making the desert bloom sounds like a great thing. It's positive, right? We go back to this structure. I love this positive value. Of course I'll give money to plant a tree. And I think it's wonderful. And look how wonderful it is. I feel good about myself because I'm helping Israel to make the desert bloom, because Palestine had been this desert wasteland for all that. So you see what I'm saying, right? So it becomes this positive thing that's grotesquely exaggerated, right? And so that's what happens. The villages, the ruins are covered up by a forest of, by a carpet of trees all over the place. If you go to the forests, the eerie thing is, if you go to the forest and you kind of peer through the trees, you see ruins. And nobody asks, what are these ruins? Why are there all these ruins here? What's happening here? But they're everywhere. Everywhere you see a forest in Israel, there are ruins. And then the trees themselves, what's very interesting about the trees is, especially in the early years of the state, the JNF, they wanted trees that would grow very, very quickly and eliminate indigenous competition. So the trees they went for were a species of pine that's from Europe. And the point of the pine was that it would make Palestine look European, because it wasn't a native pine, it was a European pine. And the other tree that they really, really liked was eucalyptus from, of course, Australia, which has a whole connotation here. But both the pine trees they planted and the eucalyptus, of course, you know about eucalyptus here, right? Eucalyptus, but these are both very, very water-intensive species. So yes, they grow very quickly, but you have to pour a ton of water, especially in a semi-arid landscape, to make them grow. But they grew quickly. They blotted out, they just completely made the ruins disappear. And they also wiped out, as much as possible, the indigenous ecosystem, because both eucalyptus and pine are very acidic. So it's like literally a kind of chemical warfare in the soil, at the level of the soil itself, to render indigenous species unable to compete, right? So they all go away. But the interesting thing is that because they're so water intensive, they're also very fragile, these trees. So they're subject to drought, which is why the JNF tells you we planted 250 million trees. They don't tell you how many hundreds of millions of them died, because they're not suited for the landscape in which they're being planted. And the other thing is they're subject to forest fires. They burn very easily, because they're so thirsty, and it's just the wrong climate for these kinds of trees. So they burn a lot. There are constantly forest fires, especially in the Galilee, for example. And just as a footnote to this, you can see, hopefully now the audience can see this structure, right? So don't focus on the villages, focus on making the desert bloom. Affirm the positive, and through the very affirmation of that positive value, making the desert bloom, we are transacting the denial of not just the ethnic cleansing of 1948, but the Palestinian presence in the land, the claim that the land is gone. You're not looking at it, you don't even know that it's there. You're denying it, but you're denying it without recognizing that you're denying it. You're denying the denial itself, is what I talk about in the book. But just as a footnote to this, what's interesting is that I grew up in Lebanon, not in Palestine, and there's a species of cactus that I grew up and that everybody I know in Lebanon thinks of as being indigenous to Lebanon. In fact, it turns out that it's not, but it's all over the place throughout the Mediterranean basin. It's called prickly pear, at least that's the common term for it. Ficus indicus is the scientific term. And so this plant is absolutely, it's all over the place in Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, throughout the Mediterranean, into North Africa. And so what's interesting is that plant was brought to the Mediterranean by Columbus, literally 500 years ago, but it became absorbed into indigenous practices, right? So Palestinian farmers planted it, partly to separate one village from another village, or to demarcate fields and things like that. So it was kind of even though it was also a foreigner, it was domesticated, it became absorbed into a native ecological and sort of rural vernacular, if you want. Because it was absorbed, right? It was like, this is an immigrant that fit in because it was friendly to fit in, and the natives welcomed it to fit in. So it became native, in effect, so much so that everybody there thinks of it as a native plant, as opposed to the eucalyptus and the, did we just lose something? And the pine.
So I think
yeah. So I think that's the contradiction between these forcibly implanted plants that are trying to eradicate the native indigenous system, as opposed to the slowly absorbed and domesticated foreignness that becomes native in effect. I think speaks
very
volumes.
interesting. And you know that, of course, that the Israelis describe themselves as sabras, as
Yes.
is the prickly. I mean,
Yeah.
they've absorbed even that.
Yeah.
Taken over that. So
And
yes,
hummus
I'm sorry.
and falafel too, but that's,
Say that again.
and they've also claimed hummus and falafel.
Yeah,
to be
100%.
theirs, too.
Yes, of course. So, but it's a story. I mean, it's familiar to us here. This story of the Zionist project is a story of imagining a terra nullius. We have the same story here. So there's the story of the tree planting by the JNF, and there's the story you tell of the consistent, relentless, consistent renaming of Palestinian villages, giving them Hebrew names. I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. It feels to me as if at every aspect, the project is one of replacement, of erasing the history, erasing who were the indigenous population in every way, but it's also a story of replacing with our own, fantasy, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. That's also a very important point. So the indigenous Arabic landscape with its nomenclature, the place names, the village names, the town names, the roads, the streets, everything has been replaced. And there was a thing called a naming committee in the 1940s and 50s. This is what they set out to do, is to rename all the Arabic names and turn them into sort of proto-biblical Hebrew names that had nothing to do with the actual landscape. That they were just arbitrarily imposed on the indigenous landscape to make the Palestinian presence, again, to make it disappear altogether and to kind of render it in as though this has always been nothing but a so-called Hebrew landscape, which of course, as we know, historically, even in biblical times, was never the case either, right? So that's part of what's going on there too.
Because it's a construct to imagine the Jewish presence there as eternal, as unchanging, eternal, universal,
Primordial.
without question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's go to some of the other sites of how we see the contradiction, the gayification of Tel Aviv, and maybe you should talk a bit about pink washing.
Yeah. So pinkwashing is an interesting endeavor that popped up in roughly the mid 2000s. And what's interesting, there's a chapter in the book on it. So the idea here is that the Israelis realized by roughly the mid 2000s that they were having a hard time in terms of public relations with the progressive cultures and subcultures in the West. I mean, people were realizing that what we were told was this wonderful progressive paradise of making the desert bloom and so forth. That's not what it was, clearly, right? People had seen by then, for instance, among other things, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006, which was a dress rehearsal for Gaza, but nevertheless, it was visually very, very distressing. People could see it. So the Israelis were very conscious that they had to do something to try and recapture this progressive image of themselves that had been so successfully propagated for decades in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so literally what they concocted, and it was a concoction, it was produced in the Israeli Ministry of the Interior and the Foreign Ministry and the Prime Minister's office. They put a lot of money into it. They said what we need to do is to present ourselves to the world as gay friendly. Right? And by the way, specifically male gay. They don't talk about lesbians. It's always male gay, which is I'll come to why. Maybe obvious why, but that's the thing. So let's push Tel Aviv very, very consciously. Let's push Tel Aviv as the ultimate gay vacation destination, and in fact, Tel Aviv as one of the great gay cities in the world, to outdo. And you know how Israelis do things like this? They do, for example, they do artificial polls of what's the gayest city in the world, and then they'll get people to vote for it. So basically, in their voting, these are supposed to be objective things done worldwide. San Francisco disappeared altogether, which is
interesting.
Which is very interesting, right? And then Berlin disappeared. Tel Aviv became like, this is the gayest city in the history of the world. And this is the place where you can go and you can be gay and you can be happy and you can be wonderful. Look at the beaches in Tel Aviv, endless pictures of muscle-bound gay men cavorting on the beaches of Tel Aviv. Look how wonderful it is. Why? Because first of all, it asserts the sort of this claim to liberal, progressive, left-leaning, tolerant, permissive, cosmopolitan, exactly.
Western.
Above all Western. Thank you. Above all Western, right? As opposed to what, of course, the flip side of this is the demonic fundamentalist wasteland of Arab and Muslim homophobia, allegedly, right? So this was the contrast. We are this wonderful Western liberal progressive culture where we have this wonderful permissiveness and everybody's included and it's a tolerant place and so on and so forth, as opposed to them over there in the hinterland. Don't look at them because the Muslims and the Arabs are homophobic and fanatics and they'll crucify gay people, which is something that the Israelis say all the time and so forth. What they don't tell you, there's several things they don't tell you. One thing they don't tell you, of course, is that if you stray 5 kilometers from Tel Aviv, you're no longer in gay-friendly territory. You're in
religious fanaticism.
Absolutely religious, fundamentalist homophobia on steroids. Endowed and empowered by the state at that. But it's not so much that, it's just that this contrast itself is false, because then Israel tries to present itself as the place where Palestinian gay people run away. Because we'll save we'll save Palestinian queer people from Palestinian homophobia. Look how wonderful we are. This is our mission, like our mission civilisatrice. We're here to save them from their own homophobia, their cultural backwardness, and so on. And that's very much how it's packaged. I come back over to the emphasis on gay male. As I said, they don't talk about lesbian presence. They don't talk about queer in general, trans, and so forth. It's gay male. That's the emphasis because of the army. And so there's a connection that's explicitly made in the marketing materials between the Israeli army as a wonderful gay army. They're not all gay, obviously, but a gay tolerant army. One of the few armies that has gay units in it or has gay soldiers and so forth. To the extent to which that's true, I couldn't tell you. But you may have noticed, you will have seen surely in the background of the previous 11 months of catastrophe in Gaza, you will have seen, again, at least I've seen again and again and again, Israeli tanks flying gay pride flags in Gaza. Like, we are doing this in the name of this because we represent not just gay freedom, but progress and
rights.
liberation and human rights and openness and diversity and tolerance, as opposed to these Muslim, barbarians who want to go back to the Stone Age and so on and so forth. So that's again how it felt.
And so interesting. When I was reading that section, I was thinking, as you say, 5 kilometres down the road, I mean, you'd be you're stoned, and the religious fanatics, reactionary fanatics, abomination.
Yeah.
So Brand Israel is such the marketing.
That's Brand Israel.
So that's Brand Israel.
That's the other thing. It was literally called this a Brand Israel. We need to rebrand ourselves. Oh, sorry. The last piece here is that so the endeavor was quickly identified by progressive, genuinely left, queer and gay circles in the West as, they're trying to use us to justify their apartheid and their viciousness and their bombing and all the rest of it. And so there was enormous pushback right away from queer organizers in the West. Not so, to a certain extent, a very limited extent, there were certain left gay groups in Israel itself that also resisted, but that was somewhat muted. But there was a lot of pushback they would try to show, for example, at the Gay Pride Festival in Toronto, for instance, or gay pride marches in various places. And local gay or queer organizations would say, no, not in our name, this is not going to work. So in that sense, pinkwashing was sort of a failure compared to the greenwashing of the planting forests over the ruins of the villages, which is a success.
I hope people don't mind that we're concentrating on these, sites of contradiction, if you like, within Israel. We will get to, the crisis and what it has meant, for Gaza and the plight of Palestinians and the future, or the prospect of a future, or a just solution. But I do think that's the material in the book, and I did want to cover that material. So I hope the audience will. Someone's got a phone call. That's all right. That's not a problem. That's all right. That's all right. It happens to all of us. That's all right. And so I hope you don't mind, because I think it's very interesting the way in which and I think this audience is politically obviously literate, but how we understand the project, which is the Zionist project. So we'll continue to talk about that for a little bit, if that's okay. So the Museum of Tolerance, another site of rich site for discussion. So it's an extraordinary a site, a franchise of the LA Museum of Tolerance. Is that right? Or
yeah.
Sort of sidebar to that.
Yeah.
A branch. That's the right.
Yeah.
So maybe talk us through all the ironies, the rich ironies that the construction, the plans, the Frank Gehry's involvement.
Yeah.
Tell us that
it's
story.
It's an extraordinary story, and that's where the title of the book comes from. So there's an organization in Los Angeles called the Museum of Tolerance, which is like a branch, itself a branch of or an arm of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in LA. And its mission is it exists as a museum in Los Angeles. It's not exactly a Holocaust museum, because there already is a Holocaust museum. So it doesn't claim to be a Holocaust museum, although the Holocaust is like the central kind of organizing rubric of the Museum of Tolerance. But then they're also very interested in other episodes of intolerance and genocide and so forth. And there's a whole litany of them. Armenia, of course, they don't mention anywhere. Darfur, they love Darfur. So Darfur constantly comes up as a theme. Why is Darfur so important, by the way, in this connection? Because, of course, who are the so-called bad guys in Darfur? It's so-called Arabs, as opposed to the so-called blacks, who are the victims of the genocide in Darfur. Of course, if you know anything about Sudan, to try to say there are Arabs here and blacks there doesn't make sense, because that's what Sudan is, simultaneously, right? So it's an institution that is trying to promote a certain narrative of the Holocaust, which in and of itself is not, obviously, that's not a bad thing at all, but to yoke that to a certain discourse about Israel and Zionism, that is where it's more problematic. Anyway, the early 2000s, actually 2004 specifically, they decided they wanted to open a branch in Jerusalem. So they found, or they were given, or they claimed to have been given a plot of land in Jerusalem by the municipality of Jerusalem. And they found the great LA architect Frank Gehry, who I'm sure you know his work, like the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao and the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, and so on and so on and so on. So they hired Gehry to build this branch of the Museum of Tolerance in Jerusalem. But it turns out that the site that they had been allocated, which they knew, was a corner, like about a quarter of the oldest and most important Muslim cemetery in Jerusalem, in fact in all of Palestine. And so and of course Muslim authorities right away said, no, you can't build there because that's a Muslim cemetery that goes back hundreds of years. In fact, it's so old, it has soldiers from Salah ad-Din's army are buried there. That's how old it is. It goes back to the medieval period. And it's been in constant use until 1948. We know people with family members buried in this cemetery. So, of course, the Muslims in Jerusalem said, you can't, that's outrageous, you can't build a museum on the cemetery. But they pushed ahead. And so they literally excavated the cemetery. They exhumed bodies, skeletons and so forth, dumped them in cardboard boxes, got rid of them, put this magnificent structure called the Museum of Tolerance, but then when you look at that's already bad enough, but it gets worse. When you look at the descriptions of what the exhibition spaces are to be, it's actually a narrative of Zionism. Mm-hmm. So it's a museum of Zionism. Actually, more specifically, it's a history that it's a museum that conflates the history of the Jewish people with Zionism. So it is to say, Jewish history, the history of the Jewish people has always been heading towards Zionism. Zionism is the culmination of the history of the Jewish people. That's what all the exhibition spaces are about, this mission of the Jewish people to become Zionists, basically. But the important thing is that the banner under which it flies is tolerance, right? So here is this Museum of Tolerance being built on another people's graveyard, from which the bodies were literally being exhumed and dumped to build this edifice to so-called tolerance. Mm. What's extraordinary about it, you all get it, right? You don't need 5 PhDs to see what's wrong with this thing. It's monstrous. It's monstrous in its thing. But to me, what was interesting about it is that it captured, in fact, that's how I figured out the argument of the book, because here it is. Don't look at the graves, because we're getting rid of the graves. Don't look at the Palestinian or Muslim claim to this land. Look at this wonderful mission, tolerance. Let's revere tolerance, and let's get Frank Gehry to build us platinum or whatever, silver kind
titanium.
of titanium. That's the stuff. Titanium kind of structure with the things and all of his signature moves, which would have also been important because had Frank Gehry built it or designed it, it would have connected also that site to the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao and Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA and all the other Frank Gehry buildings, which all look like versions of each other, right? So it would have also said this is part of a global network of high-powered cultural institutions, and that's what this is. And then you would, the cemetery, forget it. The footnote here is that this is the only thing I've accomplished in my life that I can claim. Frank Gehry, so I wrote about this in a journal called Critical Inquiry in the US. It's an academic journal. And the journal invited Frank Gehry to respond to me. And then he got the museum to respond. It was a kind of ugly debate. But the good news is I got the last word. So but that's not the point. But the point is that in the end, after this discussion with Frank, this debate with him, he pulled out of the project. So that's the one thing I've accomplished, is that he didn't design it. But unfortunately, but they still built the museum. So after him, they found another architect, and then they had a falling out with that guy. And then 20 years later, they had another architect. So now it exists. The last thing I'll say about this museum, the museum project, I think it's kind of mind-boggling. Sometimes when you look at Zionism, you think, well, these people have serious issues going on. But this museum, other than everything I've said so far, the final version of the model is to have a sort of above ground and below ground, right? So above ground is this sweeping thing that it's not Gehry, it's somebody else's design, but it's glass and steel and light and so forth. It's kind of a pretty building. And that's where the public spaces are, there's a conference center and a gift shop and a cafe and this kind of thing. The exhibition spaces are below ground, in what the architect calls a black box. That's his term, not my term. Right? So you think, you've taken a cemetery, you've removed the bodies, You're putting what you call a black box where the bodies used to be, and in this black box you're going to give us a history of the Jewish people conflated with the history of Zionism. It's kind of mind-boggling to me, but that's what that.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it? But you know, I'm thinking this is like, you know, you and I probably, and I'm older than you are, but you know, we probably remember the time when semiotics was, you know, the flavour in English and comparative literature departments. And I'm thinking, you said the living room, I think Gary talked about it being a living room onto Jerusalem, and that kind of conflation of the question of Israel and of Zionism, Israelis and Jewish identity. When you go to Yad Vashem, I was always appalled at the kind of, at the end point when you go through, you know, it's a tragic history, the history of anti-Semitism. You go through this museum and you come out at the end and it's a sheer glass front onto Israel. So the end result, always to insist and to reassert that your safety as Jews and the result, that your haven is this place. Here it is before you. When you arrive in Israel, well, I haven't been there in many, many years, but when you arrive the airport, literally Lod Airport, you go up because you're going up to Israel. It's, you know, you're making aliyah. It's you're ascending to the state of Israel. All to insist at every turn, every sign, as we know, is to assert, you know, this is your homeland. This is your inextricable connection. And I think that the task, we've certainly seen it in the US, we've seen it in the UK, we're seeing it here, the conflation of the question of Israel, that if you're critical of Israel, you're an anti-Semite, is enduring. So I wanted to take you to, before we go to the question of Gaza and why you're an optimist, you know, the institutional struggle that you've been involved with and you've observed, and the debate within universities at the political level in the media around this successful the Hasbara, you know, strategy of insisting again and again on the conflation. If you're critical of Israel, you're an anti-Semite, and how that has operated in the West, in particular in the US and in universities, which you know so well.
I gather it's operating here in Australia too. So so this has been, what's fascinating about this concept is it goes back several years. It goes back to about roughly the mid-2000s. And actually to trace the genealogy of this project is interesting in and of itself. So the idea that it should be possible somehow to conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, this idea emerged in an organization in the bowels of the European Union in the mid-2000s. And they came up with what they called a working definition of anti-Semitism. I don't know for the life of me what was wrong with the dictionary definition, which works perfectly well.
Well, we know what was wrong.
Well, we know, yes.
We know what was wrong.
But it's like they were looking for something else. And so what they came up with was this what they called a working definition, which included criticism of Israel and Israeli policy and Zionism itself as an ideology. They included this as examples of anti-Semitism. But then very quickly that group said, within a couple of years, they said, actually this is unworkable, so they kind of dropped it. And it kind of went away. And then it came back in the arms of an organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA. They found, I don't know where they retrieved it, but they retrieved it from the bowels of this EU bureaucracy.
APAC helped.
Yeah, of course they did, and the AJC and other
all of the rest of them
did. There was a lot of manipulation going on behind the scenes, like, oh, look at this. This is a good definition. Why don't we use this definition? Work. And so the definition that they proposed is one, again, in which some of the key examples they give, of course, they include things like anti-Jewish racism and anti-Jewish prejudice and so forth, which are genuine forms of anti-Semitism. But then they also say things like singling out the Israeli state is anti-Semitic, or holding it to a different standard than other states, that's anti-Semitic. Claiming that the Jewish people don't have a right to a homeland is anti-Semitic. Criticizing the Israeli state in a way that you wouldn't criticize other states is anti-Semitic. And they gave other examples. Again, the intention here was to conflate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. It was very, very clear from the way in which they were talking about it that the point of this wasn't just like a rhetorical game. The point of this was, because by then they had realized that there was a growing tendency towards criticism of Israel and of Zionism, because it was clear, more and more clear. Remember, this is the same moment of the pinkwashing project that I talked about. It was clear people were beginning to see Israel, more and more people were seeing it in the West for what it was. So this is an attempt to kind of stop that and kind of repress the knowledge that was beginning to spread by delegitimizing criticism of the Israeli state and of Zionism itself as an ideology. And so the idea was, if we can say criticism of Israel is illegitimate, it's a form of racism, basically. It's actually a little bit like that tolerance museum, right? If Zionism equals tolerance, criticism of Zionism equals, you can do it just as well as I can. It's obviously intolerance, right? So to criticize Zionism then becomes, if you say Zionism is a form of racism, that in this formula becomes, you're accused of being yourself a racist. It's Orwellian in the worst possible way. So the idea was to delegitimize criticism of Israel and of Zionism, is to say, if you engage in it, it's because you're a racist. And ultimately, the idea is, if you can get universities to adopt this definition, what it can do is it can basically banish criticism of Israel. It can say you're not allowed to criticize Israel because if you criticize Israel, it's because you're racist. So, and as various universities, including I know some here in Australia, have adopted this definition, it has made criticism of Israel, it hasn't banished it, it's not going to stop it, but it's made it more problematic because then Zionist lobby groups start saying, oh my God, she's anti-Semitic, she's criticizing a genocide in Gaza. They don't use that word, of course, but that's how it can be deployed, right? So anything you do to criticize occupation or apartheid or whatever, it's because they say you're actually anti-Semitic. In the US, it's now gotten to the point where there are universities, partly including my own, but for example, famously, just the other day, New York University announced that Zionism is a protected category. So, which is to say, kind of like the black people are protected category, or queer people or whatever, women. I mean, any kind of category, any identity category you want. Zionism is one of those things. So, just as you can't be anti-black, just as you can't be misogynistic, just as you can't be homophobic at NYU, you also can't be anti-Zionist. Because to be anti-Zionist is the equivalent of being an anti-black racist, misogynistic, misogynistic or homophobic and so forth. That's basically what they're doing. They're trying to render criticism of Israel illegal. Personally, I don't think that's possible. I think it's going to be ugly, and the whole point is to make it ugly and to make people pay a price. I think it's doomed to failure, which is where my optimism comes from. But we'll come back to the optimism.
So we've only got a few more minutes because we've agreed that we're going to take questions from the audience. So you used the term apartheid early on in our conversation, and I've been interested to see that, is it the last 5 years in Australia that term has become accepted in the media? It wasn't, it was absolutely silent. No one used that terminology in the media, for example. But in the book you talk about both the parallels and the differences between apartheid in South Africa and apartheid in Israel. And I wondered maybe if you could take us through where you see those differences in the apartheid state, the practice of apartheid in both states.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I know you may have questions, but in a nutshell, it's not just me, by the way. I mean, in terms of the structure of Israel as an apartheid state, as I said, look at the reports by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Southwest Asia published an authoritative report in 2017, authored by the international legal scholars Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley. These are comprehensive reports. The International Court of Justice in The Hague published a couple of weeks ago an advisory opinion on the legality of Israel's occupation, which includes the question of apartheid. So absolutely authoritatively, there's no question about it. What I say though, and in the book I talk about not just these legal instruments, but also a specific comparison to South Africa, the South African version of apartheid. Because what struck me as so important is that the South African version of apartheid was explicit. It said, for example, like every bathroom, every beach, every bus, every train station, blacks over here, or no, it wasn't blacks actually. It's whites over here, non-whites over there, right? And so it was very, very explicit in terms of, and it had a name. The name was apartheid, right? It gave itself a name. So, for example, in South African housing law, for instance, under apartheid, You're white, so you have to live over here. You're black, you have to live over here. You're this, you have to live over there. So it was all sort of identifying people and saying, because this is your identity, this is where you have to live. It was all prescriptive and explicit. So what I say is the Israeli version of apartheid functions in exactly the same way. So people are, I'm talking about citizens of the state, not, the occupied territories is infinitely more obvious. Citizens of the state themselves. Remember, 20% of Israel's citizens within its pre-67 outlines are Palestinian Muslims and Christians. And yes, they're nominally citizens, but they're not treated equally because every citizen in Israel is identified by the state according to their nationality. And as far as the Israeli state is concerned, if you're Jewish, you have Jewish, what they call Jewish nationality. And your rights, therefore, are attendant not on your citizenship, but on your national identity. And obviously Palestinian citizens of the state don't have Jewish nationality, and therefore, on that basis, certain privileges, above all in terms of access to the land, are withheld from them. So the way it functions in Israel, effectively, if you're Jewish, you live over here, which is 85% of the land, and if you're not Jewish, we just don't mention what happens to you. It's like you might as well not exist. So you can figure it out. Maybe you can find somewhere in the interstices of land planning to find a place to live. But we're certainly not going to say prescriptively, you're here, you're there. It's not, there was no name for it. It happens de facto, basically. So it's a form of apartheid that won't name itself as apartheid, that denies that that's what it is. And as you know, if you tell Israelis or Zionists that this is a form of apartheid, they still go purple in the face. They can't stand this accusation. They're covering up what it is that they're actually about, which is truly extraordinary. The most extraordinary thing about the Israeli version of apartheid is that it works in such a way that it's not just that a Jewish citizen has access to more rights, especially with regard to the land, than a non-Jewish citizen. In other words, a Jewish citizen has more rights in terms of accessing the land than a Palestinian citizen. Forget people living under occupation. I'm talking about within the state. But more than that, somebody who is Jewish but not a citizen actually has more rights in terms of accessing the land than a non-Jewish citizen. In other words, somebody who's Jewish from New York who is not an Israeli citizen actually can access land more readily in Israel than a Palestinian who's a citizen of the state. Imagine here you are in Australia. Imagine somebody who's French can access land in Australia that you as an Australian citizen of a certain kind don't have access to. That's what we're talking about here. So it's extraordinary. That's how it functions. So the big difference between South African and Israeli apartheid is that one embraced itself. It had a name. It called itself by a name. And it was explicit in how it functioned. And the other one denies that that's what it is, even though at the end of the day, it's de facto it's the same thing. The caveat, there's a footnote to a postscript to this, which is that in 2018, the Israeli parliament passed a bill called the Jewish Nation-State Law. Israel doesn't have a constitution, it has a series of basic laws. This became one of the basic laws, so it has kind of, in effect, constitutional status. And that law made explicit what had been the implicit forms of apartheid that had always existed. They were always there. They just became explicit in the law. So that law, I'm sure you guys have heard the phrase between the river and the sea, and what we are told that phrase means, which we can get into if you want to. But what's interesting is that law, the Jewish Nation-State Law of 2018, explicitly says, I can't quote it verbatim, but I can pretty much summarize it. Between the river and the sea, there is only Jewish sovereignty. And non-Jews need not apply for sovereignty, meaning the citizens of the state don't have, that's not their state. That's basically what it's saying. So it rendered de jure what had been de facto forms of discrimination and racism.
So my last question, Mayad is determined to wish questions, we must, is to go back to my surprise at your optimism, that you found cause for some optimism. You say that the conflict has shifted from one between an occupying power and an armed liberation movement to a confrontation between people demanding equality and a grossly unequal state. Is that why young people in the West have been galvanised by this catastrophe?
There's two things. One thing is not just young people, although especially young people. It's especially clear when it comes to young people. to university students. Not only do they increasingly recognize Israel for what it is, and they do so for several different reasons. One is that they do not rely on the Australian or the New York Times or CNN or BBC for their news. They get their news from social media. For all of its flaws, the thing about social media is it's not that there's no censorship, by the way, there is. I'll give you an example of censorship that happened just the other day. The student organization Students for Justice in Palestine at Columbia University just the other day lost their account on Instagram, which is how they were disseminating their words. So they were kicked off Instagram. Many Palestinian or pro-Palestinian organizations have lost access to Twitter or YouTube or Instagram or these other platforms. So it's not like these are not free spaces. In America, our wonderful liberatory Congress that believes in freedom of expression passed a law last year, passed a bill, it hasn't been signed into law, but it passed a bill that would make the social media company TikTok illegal in the United States. And that was explicitly pushed by Zionist organizations, above all the ADL in Washington, right? Because too many young people, and they said it, they actually came up in the congressional hearings, too many young people are getting their information from not from the New York Times, but from social media, TikTok, Twitter, largely also because they're seeing, especially these days, they're seeing raw video and raw images coming out of Gaza. When you see what's happening in Gaza, even if all you see is the images and people screaming and telling them what's happening, we can't live, I lost my children, you don't need to know. It's very, very obvious what's happening and who's right and who's wrong when you see it in those terms. So young people see it increasingly for what it is. And so there's increasing awareness of the kind of, in a way, the cat is out of the bag. There's increasing awareness of this. There is, however, also increasing repression, clearly, right? We've seen that here. Let's just say, I'll put this diplomatically, certain events that take place can be canceled. Venues can be taken away at the last minute or people in orchestras, for example, can lose their positions and so forth because of positions they're taking without naming names. And these things they're happening all the time.
All the
right?
time.
So there's this sense of constant policing and oppression and so forth. And one point I really want to make, which I think is very important, which is that when we see things like that, when we see the constant policing and patrolling and suppression and censorship and blacklisting and haranguing and lobbying and all this kind of stuff that goes on 24 hours a day, they would do 26 hours a day if they could. We think, wow, the various Zionist organizations are so powerful. Look at the influence they have in our governments, our media, our universities, which have become, in the US, I don't know about here, but our universities, as our academic years are beginning now, if you go to many of the great universities in the US, NYU, Columbia University, University of Southern California in LA, our campus too, they're blockaded and barricaded, public spaces are walled off and so forth. You have to have identity cards to get to campus. You're not allowed to wear a mask anymore. Our university said you have to wear a mask because of COVID, not saying you're not allowed to wear a mask at all, because they want you to be basically
visible, to be
visible in order to be doxxed and patrolled and surveilled and everything else. So they become incredibly repressive places. It's going to be a very, very ugly year. As I said, the thing about trying to adopt this thing where you're not allowed to criticize Israel, it becomes illegitimate, racist, et cetera, et cetera. All this stuff looks like for like, how are we going to fight this incredible power? But my optimism comes from the fact that I realized that they didn't need to do this 5 years ago or 10 years ago. They're doing it now because they are in an absolute panic, an absolute blind, sweaty panic. They know people are onto them now. People can see what's happening. People aren't stupid. They realize what's happening, and there's this attempt to try and take knowledge away and make people not talk and not read and not write and not think. That is not going to happen. People know. People are aware. Zionist organizations are fighting a desperate rearguard action. So the bad news is, in the short term, we're in for a very, very ugly period. Very ugly. The repression is going to be very ugly. the policing, the censorship, the interdiction, the harassment, the surveillance, all that stuff. That's what they're brilliant at, and they will do it very intensely. But all of that is a sign of their increasing awareness that they've lost. They've lost the world. And Gaza is kind of the epitome of that too. For all of the harm that Israel has done to the people in Gaza, and the West Bank, by the way, the West Bank it's not quite as bad as Gaza, but it's very, very bad in the West Bank. The past 2 days in Jenin in the northern West Bank, it's like Gaza in miniature, and that's likely to get worse before it gets better. So they're doing incalculable harm. They've killed 190,000 people in Gaza. They've killed almost 1,000 people in the West Bank so far this year. As I said, the hospitals, the universities, the schools, the children, the trauma, the parents, the suffering, the amputations. It's indescribable what they're doing. But among other things, what they're doing is they're demolishing their standing, their legitimacy, their image in the West. And the Israeli state depends for its existence on support in the West. The Israeli state could not do for 1 second, not for 1 second, it could not do what it's doing right now without Western support. Impossible. It needs the weapons, it needs the support in the UN, it needs the jet fuel for its bombers, it needs the bombers themselves, it needs the helicopter gunships, it needs the missiles, it needs the rockets. It needs America to defend it from incoming rockets from Iran and Hezbollah, for example, or Yemen. Right? So it needs all of this stuff to survive. What Israel has been doing the past year has been demolishing. The metaphor I like to use is it's been burning its own incubator. It's torched its oxygen generator, which is the West. And no matter what amount of repression they try to resort to, maybe in the short run they'll get away with it, but in the long run, I think it's over.
So, you're going to shepherd us through the questions. Thank you.
And we reached the second part of our forum tonight, which is the Q&A. Please, if you have any question to ask the Professor Saree, please raise your hand. We will hand the microphone to you. And
No, doctor.
So I will go first.
Okay. What worries me at the moment is the fact that the Israeli military is destroying the cultural legacy, well, not just the legacy, but the cultural heritage of Palestinians. And they've been targeting deliberately journalists, poets, writers, any intellectual, destruction of universities. And that is a huge worry, and I think they're trying to destroy the continuity of Palestinian people. I actually come from a Holocaust survivor family which has been anti-Zionist. My mother actually, before she died, I was discussing this with her, and she said to me, the Palestinians today are the Jews, and what happened to us in the 1930s and 40s. But I think what we are witnessing also is the ends of Zionism, because I think the ends of Zionism, because I think what we are witnessing is the basically the essence of Zionism is now becoming very obvious to the world, and it has been basically one of ethnic cleansing from the very beginning. This was its intent, with Herzl and so on. And I just hope that we can build up a sufficiently big critical mass that can stop this current war of annihilation and genocide of Palestinian people.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important point. I mean, the latter part of your point is that's what I concluded with a few minutes ago, and I agree. I think that Zionism is, like on our podcast, Makdisi's podcast, in November, I think, we interviewed the Israeli historian Ilan Pape, and one of the points he made was that Zionism, this is its terminal phase. Now it's just a question of how long will the terminal phase last, and how horrible will it be as it goes down. But I think we're in agreement on that. the first part of your question about the destruction that Israel is doing, yes, of course, it is indescribable, and a lot of that is going to be unsalvageable. It has destroyed the greatest mosque, some of the greatest church in Gaza. They've been destroyed.
13 universities.
It is destroyed, it's destroyed every single university in Gaza has been destroyed, right? 2/3 of the schools have been destroyed. 2/3 of the houses have been destroyed. The hospitals have been destroyed. Another person we had on our podcast, Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta, who's obviously a physician, made the point that the Israelis aren't just killing doctors in general. They are, or journalists, or writers, or poets, and so forth. But when it comes to doctors specifically, it is as though they have a list of all the specialists. Because Gaza is not that big, and so there may not be 20 kidney specialists, there's maybe one kidney specialist. So they're making sure we got the kidney specialist, we got the, whatever, the 3 ophthalmologists, we got the 3 of these, and the 2 of these, and the 1 of these, and and they're systematically going through and destroying those people, right, who are intellectuals and practitioners and people who are educated and trained and have all this experience. The point that Hassan is making is that when you kill the only nephrologist in Gaza, it's not just this person who has 30 years of practice and training and experience, but also what made him a nephrologist to begin with was God knows how many years of medical school and training, and then internship and residency and all the rest of it. Which is, and you can't press a button and replace that. You're talking about years to replace that one person, right? So I don't for one second want to say that the damage is not indescribable. It is indescribable. It will not be easily addressed. It will not be easily fixed. The poets, the writers, the teachers, the professors, the university presidents, about which I don't know about in Australia, but our American universities quickly, within days of October 7th, all of them published statements saying, we decry the violence against Israeli civilians. Not one American university has said one word about the destruction of all of Gaza's universities. Not one. Or the university presidents, or the professors and the teachers.
Well, all of them, like all the arts organisations that I'm involved with, all stood with Ukraine.
Yes,
absolutely.
Of course. So, but if you want, there's a positive twist. It's that the Palestinian people are not just in Gaza. So the Palestinian people still have writers and physicians and doctors and intellectuals and poets and so on and so forth. We'll never, that doesn't mean that we haven't lost terribly, but there is more to the Palestinian people, thankfully, than those trapped in Gaza right now. So it's not like they're not going to extirpate Palestinian culture in the way that they might think that they want to be able to do. They can't.
Thank you. Just keep your question short, please, so we can take as much question as we can, please.
Yeah. In terms of the false narrative that nothing happened before October of last year, can you say something about defining or redefining the notion Hamas? Because the media formula, certainly in this country, is that they always repeat Hamas, a terrorist organization identified by most Western governments. Can you redefine or reframe?
That's a very important thing. The delegitimization of any form of resistance. The first time I wrote about October 7th and its aftermath, in mid to late October, I made the point that if you put the events of October 7th, no matter how violent that day was, which it clearly was, but if you put it back into a wider context of colonialism and rebellion against colonialism, one of the examples I gave, the Haitian Revolution, the Algerian Revolution, the French, obviously the French Revolution, that's not colonialism, but the resistance to the British in India. There's a litany of these things. One of the examples I gave was Nat Turner's slave rebellion in the United States. Right? Nat Turner today in the United States is thought of as a kind of American hero. When Nat Turner and his men rebelled, they broke free, and they rose up against the people who used to own them as slave owners. They massacred men, women, and children. Colonialism is replete with instances like that. So the first step to understand is that colonialism itself, as Frantz Fanon taught us years ago, is itself an organization and expression of violence. It is violence, and it produces violence. So if we want to address the instance of October 7th, but really colonial violence in general, we have to address the cause, not the symptom. Right? So October 7th is a symptom, it's not a cause. It comes out of, in that case, 75 years of violence and dispossession and torture and ethnic cleansing and so on and so on. If we want that to stop, we have to stop the conditions that produced October 7th. Lastly, this is a really important point that you're raising too. Hamas specifically. There's something that's extraordinary in the Western mainstream media, obviously our governments too, their inability to listen to what it is Hamas is saying. It doesn't matter what you don't have to agree with them, you don't have to even like them, but you're dealing with human beings here. For good or for ill, right or wrong, that doesn't matter. I mean, there's all kinds of human parties and organizations that I personally disagree with too, but you still want to understand, what are they thinking? These are not monsters, they're not animals, they're not from outer space. They're produced by historical circumstances, like all human movements, for good or for ill, produced by social and political and historical circumstances. So, but this absolute unwillingness to understand them, to me, is absolutely mind-boggling. And you're right, it's not just our governments that do that for their own reasons, it's our mainstream media. This is it's a terrorist organization, and then as soon as most Western readers hear that word or see that word, terrorism, boom, their mind is shut. You know, it's like the mind goes into sleep mode, and then nothing else can be said. No further thought required. I have a footnote, by the way, on that word. Since you raised it, it's an important word. As somebody who happens to be a scholar of the 18th and 19th centuries, do you all know when the word terrorism entered the English language? This is always worth noting, by the way.
This is a rhetorical question. We don't have to answer. There's no exam. We're not going to don't leave us hanging.
It entered the English language in the 1790s to refer to a form of government. The French terror. The original terrorists were people who espoused Robespierre and those guys, right? So it referred to a form of government by terror. And then somehow, I don't know how, at some point it was flipped around and became something that governments react to, counter-terrorism, right, as opposed to a form of government. We should be wary of that word. I've said this before, but if I was like a wizard of some kind, if I could abolish one word in the English language, that would be the word I would abolish. It has done so much harm because it's so badly misunderstood, and above all, because people's minds shut down when they see that word. It's disturbing.
But also push out assiduously the political nature of that act of resistance. Doesn't it? That's what it's intended to do.
Yeah.
It's not just to dull the mind or to kind of take one's mind away from being terrified.
Yeah.
It's also to empty of it any political
And historical.
And historical.
One more thing.
Look, you can
There's a literary component to
Yes.
it.
Go for it.
I was at a conference recently on British Romantic culture, and there was one of the papers in Washington. One of the papers was on, actually it wasn't a romantic writer, the great Afro-Caribbean writer, one of the great Afro-Caribbean writers. And the poem was one, I saw it on the table because it was like a handout, and it was all about the wonder how we must resist. We will fight them, we will kill them, we have to fight back. And this poem was being taught, in this instance, in this seminar, it was being taught as, look at people fighting, the victims of colonialism, slavery, fighting back. It's by Claude McKay. Fighting, I forgot the name of the poem, but it's about fighting back, we have to resist, the cost will be terrible, we must resist at all costs, and so forth, which of course, from the perspective of the empire back then would have been seen as terrorism. But here it's revered because there's this remove of 80 or 90 or 100 years, now it seems kind of safe by comparison that it can be venerated and taught in a literary conference. But try to find the Palestinian version of that, it would not be taught at an English lit conference today, maybe in 100 years.
Tariq Ali recently interviewed Rashid Khalidi in the New Left Review, a long interview. I don't know if you've read it.
No, sorry.
It's in the journal. Well, he refers to the relationships between Palestinians and the various Arabic countries surrounding Palestine and Israel's involvement with those countries and the geopolitics of the general region. I just wonder if you'd comment on how the genocide has been received in the Arab world.
That's a very important point. And when one talks about the Arab world, there's two things that need to be made, 2 points need to be made right away. First of all, not all Arab countries are the same, because there are 2 Arab countries that are, in fact, actually actively helping Palestinians. One is Lebanon, and the other one is Yemen. Right? Yemen has closed off the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Nobody comes to go. But more to the point, the other thing that needs to be taken into account is the difference between Arab governments and Arab people. All of the regimes that Washington has carefully inculcated throughout the Middle East are despotic, tyrannical, authoritarian regimes whose primary enemy is their own people. And these regimes are supported, armed, financed, abetted, aided, etc. by Washington. That's what these are their so-called friends. So they repress their own people. The people themselves are outraged about what's happening in Gaza. All of them are. But their regimes are in this system of, I wouldn't say alliances, but self-interested relationships with the US. The Egyptian army, which basically runs Egypt, has immense profits based on all kinds of relationships and transactions with the US, and then also smuggling in and out of Gaza. It profits from all this kind of thing. The Saudis, the Gulf, etc. That's what's going on. There's this set of really draconian, from my perspective, illegitimate and autocratic regimes that are maintained by Washington as it has maintained such regimes around the entire world for the better part of 200 years. So I think we need to take that into account. But as I said, there is also resistance elsewhere in the Arab world, including in Lebanon, including in Yemen, and other parts of the Arab world as well.
Michael, please.
Professor Makdisi, are you concerned about the possibility of a Trump election victory on the Palestine solidarity movement in the United States and globally?
No. I mean, obviously I'm not enthusiastic about Trump, but the sad fact of the matter is that between Trump and the Democrats, the Republicans and Democrats, it makes no difference. When it comes to Palestine, for now, they are one half dozen of the other. What they do, really, there's no difference. Like I said, we have allegedly a liberal, progressive, democratic government right now, and it has supplied tens of billions of dollars and tens of thousands of tons of explosives and ammunition and bombs and all the rest of it to the Israelis, and endless cover in the United Nations and so forth to transact this genocide. So people always say Trump is so horrible and Trump is this and Trump is that. Yeah, of course he is, but he didn't. No matter what you say about Trump, he didn't oversee a genocide. Might he have overseen it? Maybe, I don't know, but.
But his son-in-law thinks Gaza would make great property development.
Yes, his son-in-law is also not the sharpest tool in the shed.
Not the sharpest. I thought that was an Australian idiom.
But so my point is, when it comes to the Democrats and the Republicans, there's not. But there's, as usual, I always add footnotes to these things. So the 2 footnotes I would add here is, as I said earlier, the Democratic Party is much, much, much more split around this issue than the Republican Party is. So in the medium to long run, there is some kind of hope that eventually the Democratic Party might be a home for resistance to these kinds of things in a way that it's inconceivable right now. So in the short run, between a Democratic and a Republican presidential candidate, there's zero difference when it comes to Palestine, they're all the same. But in the long run, I think that there is hope, and I think part of why there is that hope is that as Israel has shifted increasingly away from this regime of denial and mystification and equivocation and covering up what it's doing, as it comes out as the violent enterprise that it always was, but it's become more explicit now. It's embracing its inner Ben fear, so to speak. Right? It's become clear what it's doing. What that means is it's losing support on the left end of the political spectrum, in the US and other countries too. Support for Israel is increasingly a matter of the right, not the left. And so what that means is, in general, at least, again, speak to America, that's the context I know best, increasingly, not necessarily the parties, but the people, the voters, the voting blocs, the constituencies that support Israel are the same ones that favored deporting immigrants and harassing minority communities and policing the black community in America and imprisoning people and doing the kinds of things the right wing specializes in doing, which is repression, basically, right? Whereas there is hope, I think, in the medium to long term, more of the left of the political spectrum, which in the US means the Democratic Party, especially when we look at the student movement now, and we know that those students are eventually going to be in the Democratic Party or some left wing, some left party in a way. So that the future, in that sense, another reason for optimism here, I think there's the possibility that within a couple of election cycles, we might start seeing more of, if nothing else, at least equivocation or more care in the Democratic Party. But for the short term, between this presidential candidate or that presidential candidate, it actually makes no difference at all.
I found it a very interesting discussion. I'm thinking of what we can do to actually set corrective mechanisms in place. There are two, and they affect much more than just this issue. But in this one, I think they're critical. The first one is the loss of history as a skill that's taught and understood. I have learned so much by relearning modern history. The second is the quarantining of data, which is leading to decreased trust in organizations. Both of those can be corrected. I'd be interested in your comments as how useful they would be in this particular, almost impossible set of conflicts.
That's again, thank you. That's a very important question. The larger parameters you're talking about, I could talk about that for an hour, I'm not going to, but you're talking about a much bigger social and cultural issue than we can pay attention to here. But in terms of Palestine specifically, actually what I would say is there are people who are learning and who are studying history and the data around Palestine, as well. They are students who are learning increasingly from each other and from faculty with whom they're working kind of more outside the classroom than inside the classroom. So historical practices are changing. They're changing more informally, which doesn't mean, eventually there might be a way where the informal eventually works its way into formal structures. Let me give you an example to ground this a little bit. In those Palestine solidarity encampments in the United States, again, I can't speak to Australia, but in the US, a lot of what happened in those encampments, which persisted for several weeks, was intensive learning and studying. Intensive. They were the one at my university had an open library where people could share books and so forth. There were teach-ins all the time. There were lectures provided by faculty members or by the students working in reading groups and working together. So there is this thirst for historical knowledge, data literacy around these questions and so forth. I think it's there. I think our institutions, however, our educational institutions in particular, this is the more general part of the question, have systematically been underfunding or defunding the humanities in general, right? Including obviously history, but also literature, the arts, and so on and so forth. So what we need to do collectively is to push on both fronts, to push our governments insofar as these institutions are state-funded, as they are here and they are in many of the major universities in the US, including my own university, to push our governments to restore and indeed to increase funding for humanities and critical social sciences, which needs to be done urgently, rather than pushing everything into STEM, which is what they're trying to do. And the second thing we need to do is to talk, when it comes to Palestine specifically, we go back to what I was saying a while ago about the repression, or the attempt to repress and silence and censor and blacklist and cancel and so forth things around Palestine. The more people who talk about Palestine, the harder it is to repress. So if everybody's doing events around Palestine, those of you who are academics in your own institutions, teach Palestine. It doesn't have to be just a course on Palestine. A book about a Palestinian, a book by a Palestinian author, or a Palestinian film, or a Palestinian narrative, a Palestinian essay, Palestinian feminism, Palestinian culture, Palestinian whatever. It's all over the place, right? Good Palestinian archives. There's all kinds of forms of Palestinian cultural expression that can be taught. The more people engage in this kind of work, the more more people talk about Palestine, the harder it is to repress. And then the kind of learning you're talking about will be facilitated and will hopefully be able to be reinstitutionalized in our more liberated cultures, systems of higher education.
Thank you. I will take a woman first because being all men talking, so we'll give a so first I'll go ahead, please, and then second, third.
Thank you, Professor Makdisi and Louise. A wonderful conversation.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I'd just like to ask if you have a comment on the recent initiative by the Chinese to invite the 14 disparate Palestinian groups to come and try and forge some kind of, I don't know, harmony, I guess. Yeah, just a comment on that. And I'm sorry, I'm greedy. And the second follow-up on that is if either of you, if you have any comment in general on the role of BRICS in this whole situation.
The BRICS countries.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very important issue. So what it reminds us of is that we often, when we look at Israel, we often take for granted, well, Israel is unassailable, or Israel is a people, or Israel derives its strength from the United States, right? And because America has been the dominant power in the world since World War II, but at least even more significantly since 1989, 1990, right? But what events like the one you're drawing our attention to, China trying to now play a role, China also, among other things, helping to facilitate at least some kind of architecture of a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which of course America has failed abysmally to do anything like that. The rise of the BRICS countries, all of these things are signals that, or reminders that, the great age of American hegemony and power is slipping away. America has very, very, very grievous problems on its hands, domestically as well as on the international scene. America has a lot of work to do to shore up the most basic thing, infrastructure. If you've been to the US, you know our roads and bridges and infrastructure is crumbling. It desperately needs to have all that stuff to reinvest in its own great infrastructure, right? Our educational systems have been systematically defunded and disinvested from. Same thing with healthcare, same thing with all kinds of public social systems. America's power is not unlimited, it's not everlasting. And what we're beginning to witness is, I would say, I can't say we're in an age of American decline quite yet, but what you're talking about reminds us that American power is contingent and it's not there forever. And that the Israelis, insofar as they depend on American largesse, kind of open-endedly, and if you think about it, what drives part of what drives other Western countries to support the Israelis is the U.S. itself. They do it to curry favor themselves with the U.S. I don't know if that's the case in Australia. I don't know about Australia, but certainly many of the European countries are doing it, not because it's in Europe's interest, but because Big Brother is trying to do so. So it'll go along with what the big guy in the street says to do. So insofar as we start to see a decline in American power, especially in economic terms, possibly the decline of the dollar, America might need to focus its own energy on itself. And then we realize, of course, increasingly that, some people like to think of Israel as a strategic asset for the United States. It has only ever been a strategic liability for the United States. So it does not serve America's interests. It does not serve America's agenda, which is why lobbying, or the Zionist lobbying networks in the US are so formidable, is precisely because it's an unnatural relationship. It's not an organic relationship like the one between the US and Britain, let's say, or even the US and France or Germany. Right? It's something that needs to be constantly manipulated and played with, which is why AIPAC, the main lobbying organization, is crowing that they spent $100 million on our election cycle so far this year, which is extraordinary that the representative of a foreign country is saying, look at how we manipulated American elections. It's quite extraordinary. So the short version of the answer to your question is, I think China's role and the rise of the BRICS power, BRICS states and countries and economies, maybe some kind of joint currency, I don't know, maybe it's too early to speculate that, remind us of the fragility of the US dollar hegemony and US power in general, and hence, to the extent that Israel depends on that, also the the situation that Israel will find itself in, on top of all the other things we're talking about, that's yet another factor, I guess we could say.
Thank you. Next.
Okay, thank you really very much, and also Louise for this conversation. I think that not just in the mainstream media, but even in these communities, in activist circles, or in in the world that has woken up and supports the independence of Palestine and the struggle for liberation, we take, I think, too little time to stop and think in the way that you've helped us to do tonight. So the poem is called "If We Must Die." The Claude McKay poem that you
Yes, that's it.
mentioned, and I just wanted to read one of the. It's a sonnet, right?
I thought it was longer than that, but go ahead.
Well, it's looks like a sonnet to me.
Yeah.
Part of it says.
Professor of English and
I've seen it.
Does it have 14 lines?
Yeah, it does. It's billed, in fact, somewhere as a Shakespearean sonnet. I'm not sure if that means anything. One of the stanzas says, "If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honour us, though dead." And the question I wanted to ask was, I mean, it strikes me that McKay is onto something here, that there is something beyond the objects of life that can be, held onto or striven toward, even if we must die in the process, even if there is no hope that we will succeed in getting them. I'm thinking about denial and also disavowal, right? There's repression, there's just forgetting, there is the entirely, or the more or less successful kind of pushing down of the truth. Then there is this denial. Yeah, okay, I have a question, all right. There's the denial that you spoke about, which is, look over here because what's really happening is over here and we don't want you to look at that. And that's kind of like a plot, right? But what about disavowal in the sense of, like, at some level, I know very well that this museum of tolerance is built on a graveyard, but all the same I'm going to act as if it's a museum of tolerance. What does this kind of denial or disavowal bespeak of of what is untold that is known by Zionism, by fascism, by...
That's a really important question. I think what I can do, this might be, I mean, you're asking a huge question. I'll see I'll bite off.
I had to wrap it up.
I know. Well, I'll bite off one angle, right, or one corner of it, which is to say, what happens when Zionists who have been engaging in these forms of denial have the possibility for that denial slowly taken away from them, which is gradually what's happening too, which is why so many people who used to be Zionists are no longer Zionists and are abandoning Zionism and turning to embrace the Palestinian cause. This is why we see, for example, so many of the supporters for Palestinian liberation in the United States at this point, not all, but many people in the campus, on our campuses last year, were Jewish students, Jewish faculty, and so forth. That shift, which we addressed earlier, Louise, that shift is, I think it speaks to the abandonment of these mechanisms of denial. But what it also speaks to, and something that's very important for us, is not everybody will abandon denial. Some people will go deeper into the denial. Like the whole thing with October 7th, like that piece in the LA Times that I read the other day, which was profoundly disturbing. Because I cannot, I mean, I get it, I've written a whole book about denial. I understand there are people who are in denial, but sometimes when you look at it, you go, my God, how can you not say one word, not one word about this cataclysmic, monstrosity that's happening that you, as the writer, as an American taxpayer, are helping to facilitate, even marginally. I get it. I mean, I intellectually can understand it, but emotionally it blows my mind sometimes. But what we realize is that not everybody who's engaging in denial is ever going to come out of the shell of denial. They're going to be stuck in it. And so I don't know if this is where you wanted to go, and maybe it's not, whatever, I'll speak for myself. I think some people have this idea that the other side needs to be persuaded. that we need to say, oh God, you guys stop the denial, can't you see what's happening? Don't you understand what you're doing, what you've always been doing? I don't think that the other side needs to be persuaded or convinced of the error of their ways. And the reason why I say that is that, and I've written this in this book and other books too, and other pieces as well, there has never been, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, there's never been a group of people in history who've been endowed with privileges, political privileges, as the Jewish citizens of Israel have vis-a-vis the non-Jewish citizens and all the other non-Jewish inhabitants of the land, 50% of the population of Palestine right now. No privileged group in history has ever given up its privileges because it thought it was the right thing to do. Right? Never happened. Right? And so we have to, and the examples I often give are white South Africans did not abandon apartheid because they read Winnie Mandela's memoirs and said, what have we done? I feel really bad. The other example I often give is the European aristocracy, since I work in the 18th and 19th centuries. Why do I keep quoting this thing? The European aristocracy did not abandon their hereditary political privileges and allow European countries gradually to become democratic societies because they read Tom Paine's Rights of Man. If they weren't persuaded, they were forced. Slave owners in the United States did not abandon slavery because they read Uncle Tom's Cabin. They abandoned slavery because they were compelled to abandon slavery, right? So groups that have privileges don't renounce their privileges just because they feel bad, because they've been persuaded, because they come out of the shell of denial. They abandon their privileges when they're forced to abandon their privileges. And obviously, in the case of the American slave owners, I'm talking about, in that case, it was a war that forced them to abandon their privileges. In the case of South Africa, I think it was a non-violent campaign of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. And there are many other instances as well where boycotts, divestments, and sanctions and other non-violent campaigns have had the effect of coercing people who have privilege to abandon their privilege. My conviction is Zionists who are deep in the well of denial, just leave them there. They're not going to. It's not worth it. You can't. I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't know how to convince people that can't you. Like that guy who wrote that article the other day. I can't get in that guy's head. I'm never going to be able to persuade him. I don't need to persuade him. What I need to, and he's welcome to his individual opinion. But insofar as he's standing for a political system that requires fundamentally that some people are privileged over others, we have to undo that system of privileges, which is racist, and everything that it stands for, institutionally, legally, juridically, programmatically, politically, and so forth. We have to bring that about, and as far as I'm concerned, the thing that we in the West can do is all of us engage in boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. Right? In Sydney, the Israeli football team, thank God they didn't make it to the Champions League, but they shouldn't be in UEFA at all. Right? There should not be an Israeli team playing in FIFA at all. The Israelis should not have had athletes in the Olympics. Just the South Africans didn't either, right? So that's what we can do. Can you all write to FIFA, the organizing committee of the World Cup, the Olympic Committee, blah, 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 or your local Australian versions of all those things? Yes, of course you can. If you all do that, if we all do that, that is a form of exercising the power that we do have as ordinary citizens. When we boycott companies that profit from the occupation, the apartheid, or the genocide, I can take a choice not to go to a particular coffee company, for example, whose stock value has been plunging recently because of the boycott. That's something you can't force me to drink that coffee anyway. It's terrible coffee. So there's something that we can do. There are lots of things we can do that don't involve persuasion. They involve coercion, non-violent coercion, which is what I believe in. And I think that's what all of us have the capacity to do. And it should be full spectrum. It should be the academic boycott, the cultural boycott, the sports, very important. South Africa, if you talk to South Africans, the sports boycott really, really hurt them. The sense of isolation, the sense that when a South African went, they felt like they were pariahs. They need to be felt, they need to be made to feel like pariahs. They ought to be pariahs. Any country, by the way, I'm sure you know this, Those polls from Tel Aviv University that consistently show 90% of Jewish Israelis support the genocide. And that's by their own polls. It's astonishing. That society needs to be taught through isolation. You cannot do things like this. Like, enough is enough. We need to isolate you till you learn the error of your ways, not by persuasion, but by compulsion. Non-violent compulsion, I want to emphasize. So that's what we want to do.
I will take last few questions, and then we finish, please.
Hi, Saree. Sorry. Okay.
Hi.
Sorry, a different kind of question, but I guess I want to ask about the podcast, about Makdisi Street. And what's so, as well as the brilliant interviews, what's so beautiful about it is hearing you three brothers interact and talk and think together. And I guess I wondered if you could say something about the podcast as a practice of, you talk about each other and then you also talk about other family members, and guests will talk about other family members, and can you talk about it as a practice or a culture of Palestinian family making, I guess?
Thank you. That's too much. I would say, so those of you who don't know, Louise kindly mentioned it too. My brothers and I started a podcast in October called Makdisi Street. It's our name, our family name. The kind of pun is that there's a street in Beirut called Makdisi Street too, but named after our family. So the podcast began really as, it was myself and my two brothers who were also academics. Karim is a professor of international relations at the American University of Beirut, and Osama is a distinguished professor of history at the University of California in Berkeley. So we started this podcast mostly because in October we didn't know what else to do. And we started it by talking just the three of us. So the family relationship is that that's what we've always done with our parents too, and then often with now kids and whatever. And we come from a very academic family, uncles and aunts and my grandfather. Both of my parents are also academics, and so on and so on. And so in that sense, again, it's like, hit play, hit record, and have a family conversation. But what we've also been fortunate in being able to do is to bring in a whole litany of guests that's going to continue now in this second year of the podcast. Everybody from Francesca Albanese, Ilan Pape, Maya Wynn, Rashid Khalidi, Hassana Pusita, Salmana Pusita, it's kind of a lot of people have come through the podcast. And we're able, because one of us is an international relations person, one of us is a literary scholar, and writes on Palestine a lot, one of us is a historian. We have kind of a range of different, and we've all established in the field, so we have a pretty wide range of people that we know, many of whom will be called upon, by the way, in this room. So we can bring in people to have these conversations too. I think it's been therapeutic, and what I'm struck by is that wherever we go, all three of us, my brother Karim was in the tube, the underground system in London, who was going down an escalator, and somebody was going up an escalator, and somebody said, "Are you from the Makdisi Street podcast?" Okay, we're not quite that status yet. It is, I think it kind of, there's a need for these kinds of things. I think there's a need for these conversations that we're having. I mean, I think that, look at all of you coming out on, what was today? Thursday night. Well, I mean, why are you all here?
That's what we do in Melbourne.
It's not just for Louise and me, it's also because people want to talk about this issue. The podcast kind of captures that thirst. I think that's maybe the best way for me to say it.
But you, I asked him before we came to this part, and there are no brother jokes. My brother and I could not do a podcast without, jokes. They're offline. You could let a little bit of that come through.
You can see if you
listen carefully.
You'll every now and then hear.
You slapping down, saying you're wrong or something like that, gently. Of course.
It's gentle. Yeah, it's gentle.
You're wrong. Are you the eldest brother?
I am the eldest brother.
Yeah, I thought all the signs of an older brother.
I'm Austrian background, and I've just come back from Austria, and as you can imagine, this whole issue is very complicated over there. And it's denial of genocide, the repression, the censorship is next level in Austria and Germany. It's literally next level.
Is Austria as bad as Germany? I don't know.
Yeah, unfortunately, but yeah, it's bad. It's really bad, and it's very difficult for people to actually speak up. And I guess there's this discourse now in Austria and Germany where, of course, anti-Semitism is imported, blaming, migrants who are not European necessarily, or Muslim background, for importing anti-Semitism. When at the same time you have literally far-right groups, or the National Front in France or in Germany, the idea of like marching, saying, we we're against anti-Semitism. It's the most bizarre thing I've ever come across. But I guess you might want to comment a little bit around these really strange bedfellows, well, maybe not so strange anymore, fascists and Zionists. But I also want to ask you a bit about the question of courage, because what I've also seen, courage. Because what I've also seen is these incredible young, and not so young, anti-Zionist Jewish people in Germany, in Austria, Palestinians, all of them speaking up when they get some of the most brutal repression, and they keep speaking up. And I just think it's very heartening, actually.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Actually, let me begin with that, because over the past year, I guess really the past spring, our northern spring, so March, April, May in the US, and June in fact, the people that have really, really kind of blown me away with their courage, but their principle, their steadfastness, their resolve, their integrity are the students in all those encampments. They are absolutely extraordinary. So, and I was saying earlier in response to that other question, the way that they're talking with each other, they're learning, they're studying, they're thinking, they're connecting, but also, again, in an American context, I can't speak to the Australian one, I'm sure there's the same thing happening here, but they're also connecting the dots between, for example, Black Lives Matter in the US and the Palestinian cause, or indigenous rights in the US, or immigrant rights, things like that, land rights, all these, because of course they're all connected. The prison industrial complex, the weapons manufacturers. Remember, the student demands in the US are not necessarily ceasefire in Gaza. Yeah, they've been demanding it, but the more potent demand they're making is for our universities to divest from companies that profit from the genocide, which is very local in that sense. And of course, those are many of the same companies that profit from prisons in the United States and from weapons manufacturing and so on. So they're connecting the dots. But the most amazing thing about the students is their fearlessness. These students are, this new generation, I mean, of course I did things like that when I was in college too, a long time ago, but, and it's totally amateur. So when I look at these students compared to what we were doing 40 years ago, we were all, not just me, it was my generation compared to this generation. This is a whole new league, right? Which is also why I think they will never be beaten, because of the principle that they're summoning, but also something else, you put your finger on it. When you look at the encampments in the United States, and I spoke at a number of them, not just ours, but at other campuses too, the most amazing thing to my mind was, and again, back in the 80s when I was in university, the preponderance of people protesting and so forth were Palestinians and Arabs and sort of Muslims and the immediately allied communities. But if you look at the encampments now, yeah, you're going to see the odd Arab-looking face, whatever that means, but you see mostly white people and Latinx people and Asian people and Jewish people, full spectrum, right? Different sexual modes of expression and gender modes of expression, men, women, everything. So there's a kind of intensity that they have. And I want to say one last thing about the thing that most impressed me, again, speaking about the ones on our campus too, when they faced down, so our students, they formed the encampment, they were, for nights, they were assaulted every single night by Zionists. This was in the community from off campus. And then there was a culminating attack on what's the last day of April? April 30th or 31st, whatever the last day of April is. And that was an attack that began at sort of 6 p.m. and it continued until 3 or 4 in the morning. That involved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Zionist agitators from the community and this is part of what your question is getting at too, with Proud Boys. You know who the Proud Boys are? They are like the American version of like the right, the far, the ultra-nationalist, white nationalists, but card-carrying anti-Semitic white nationalists. So there they were with the Zionists attacking our students and our faculty, many of whom are Jewish, right? Not all. And but the students who defended the encampment, all of them went through their own nonviolent de-escalation training. And so when they were attacked, when they come out, even under smaller attacks, their main mode of defense was not to fight back, it was nonviolent resistance. And so they had a kind of fort, because nonviolent resistance is much more difficult than fighting back. Much, much, much more difficult. It involves much more bravery. I mean, in a way, I was astonished at how brave they were. So even on normal things when they put some raging Zionists come screaming at them, hurling abuse at them and so forth, their immediate tactic was don't look, don't respond, don't engage, just have nothing to do with them. Just act like these people don't exist. And there's a kind of strength in that I'm convinced is indomitable. There's no way these students are going to lose. There's just no matter what the repression is from the universities. And the flip side of that is that not just the Proud Boys, but if you look at the legislative means being addressed in the United States at least, the people pushing the legislative agenda, yes, there are some Zionist representatives and senators and so forth, but the bulk of this stuff is coming from the far right in the US. Far right, it speaks to what I was saying earlier about the shift from left to right in terms of support for Zionism. It's become a right-wing thing rather than a left-wing thing as it had been for decades. But the most interesting thing is that the right-wing senators and congressmen and so forth who are passing legislation who are now, they love Israel and so forth, these people are right-wing, racist, anti-Semites to a core. Absolutely, right? So we're seeing this convergence between the advocates of Zionism in the United States and card-carrying anti-Semites, right? And full fascists and racists. And this is like this diabolical stew that has right in the heart of it this built-in set of contradictions against the students with their steadfastness, their courage, their belief, their discipline, their rigor. I know if I were to bet, I know who I would bet on. I mean, no question asked.
Thank you. We are very close to finish. Two things to do for that. I will ask, on behalf of Jewish Council Israel, I will ask Aviva to come and say a few words, please.
Thank you. I know everyone wants to go and have dinner, have toilet stop. I know I certainly do. So I'm actually going to halve what I was going to say. So please bear with me. This will be short. Firstly, I would just like to acknowledge that we're on the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to thank Professor Saree Makdisi and Louise Adler for this incredible evening and this talk, and to thank Free Palestine Melbourne for organising it and inviting the Jewish Council of Australia to be involved. My name, as you heard, is Aviva Tuffield, and like Louise Adler, I'm a member of the Jewish Council's Advisory Board. I'm going to say just a few short words on behalf of the co-executives of JCA, Sarah Schwartz and Dr. Max Kaiser, who are sorry they couldn't be here tonight. The Jewish Council came into existence in February 2024 in the context of Israel's bombardment of Gaza in order to provide an independent Jewish voice to impose all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, and support Palestinian freedom and justice. We're a group of Jewish academics, lawyers, writers, publishers, and teachers, and we're all volunteers. Our formation was accelerated by Israel's extreme military response in Palestine and the horrendous ongoing slaughter of civilians being done in our name. We were also deeply concerned at the weaponization of anti-Semitism by the local Zionist organizations. We see this weaponization when almost every act of solidarity with Palestinian people is deemed anti-Semitic. It means that important criticism of Israel's assault on Gaza is being shut down by false accusations of anti-Semitism and distracting news stories about social cohesion. Many local Jewish organisations have become nothing more than Israel lobby groups, telling the world that the Jewish community is united in its support for Israel and the IDF. The devastating thing about this conflation of Jews and Israel is that it actually breeds racism in all directions. It allows Palestinian people and their supporters to be painted as enemies of the Jews. It means Jewish community organisations become mouthpieces for racism, which we've seen in the language around Palestinian refugees fleeing death and persecution, and the claims that they hold values incompatible to living alongside Jews in Australia. The Jewish Council believes we need to combat anti-Semitism as part of the wider fight against all forms of racism and bigotry, especially Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. To single out anti-Semitism as an exception undermines wider efforts to fight racism in this country and will only drive division. Australia already has a Race Discrimination Commissioner with a mandate to address racism, and the Jewish Council does not support the appointment of an anti-Semitism envoy, nor an inquiry into the rise of anti-Semitism on university campuses as stand-alone initiatives. They need to be part of a wider anti-racism policy. Anyway, to find out more about JCA, you can visit our website, jewishcouncil.com.au. But in closing, I'd just like to read a very short poem, because in my day job, please indulge me, I work as a publisher, and one of the writers I have the honour of publishing is the Arab-Australian poet Omar Saka. And he's written a series of poems recently, collectively titled The Nightmare Sequence, reflecting on the current genocide in Gaza. And each poem has a different title ending with the words, "in the genocide," much like the name of this event tonight. So I thought it would be fitting to read one of his works. It's called Looking Away in the Genocide. Looking away in the genocide, I have too many times to count. There's no anaesthetic left. Do you understand? Nothing to blunt the pain. I'm no hero. This isn't brave. It's a blank page, my pen and blood. In my chest, I have a stadium of dead children. I swear it's full, yet every day another is added. It isn't the dead I look away from. It's the debt owed the living, dragging down my eyelids, turning stay into flee, turning love into solidarity, something bearable, distant, apolitic. I'm trying to see and not scream. Therein lies the problem. Thank you.
On behalf of Demilitarise RMIT, I would like to invite Tammy and anyone to the stage to say something.
Thanks so much for coming here, and RMIT University, where you are currently sitting, is on stolen Wurundjeri country, and sovereignty was never ceded. And thank you so much for this amazing talk and for everybody's contributions through questions. Just wanted to say a couple of words about Demilitarise RMIT. We're a small staff-led group made up of members of the RMIT University community, concerned about RMIT's ongoing ties to bodies actively involved in the genocide waged by Israel against the Palestinian people. We have some core demands which are on the flyer that you would see either on your seat or on the registration table outside. They include things like disclosure of all the ties to weapons manufacturers and to state, federal and foreign defence departments, which RMIT has a lot of. And it includes withdrawal from land forces, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. Land forces being the largest weapons expo in the Southern Hemisphere, which RMIT unfortunately has a stall in. Shame. So we are still a small group, but we've built up from the success of the Get Elbit Out of RMIT campaign in October 2020. Really privileged to have co-hosted and led collaborative events with students, with Free Palestine Melbourne, with APAN, I can see a few of you here, and with staff from other universities. We also have an open letter to the Vice-Chancellor, and members of our group have met with the Vice-Chancellor to broach some of these demands. Unfortunately, the response wasn't what we wanted, but we can now say we've done it as we campaign around the Vice-Chancellor. We have also aligned ourselves with the NTU, the Tertiary Education Union here, movement to build toward a national BDS motion, a national level NTU BDS motion, which we're hoping to get closer toward at a forum on the 3rd of September. I hope those of you who are a member of the union will come to that. Boycotts include industrial strength and using our power as workers to withhold our labour and to make decisions about where we want, you know, our employment kind of activities to be directed. Before I pass on to Anwen, who has played a major role in leading the event today, I just want to say that, so I'm also a Jewish member of Demilitarise RMIT, and the group is open to people of all faiths, gender identities, ethnic backgrounds, ages and abilities. And that, to me, reflects the genuine richness and diversity of the international struggle for Palestinian resistance that we've seen more broadly. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you to our amazing speakers, Saree and Louise. This has been a truly incredible conversation. To Free Palestine Melbourne and the Jewish Council of Australia for inviting us, Demilitarise RMIT, to partner on this event, and to everyone here tonight, thank you for coming out and joining this conversation. Here in so-called Australia, of course, another example of a place where the privileged hold on tight to their powers. It's really important to be able to make space for these types of conversations, especially in a climate of ongoing censorship and silence, particularly in publicly funded education institutions that exist on unceded land and claim to promote intellectual and academic freedom. As a PhD student, it can often seem as though there is a significant divide between theory and practice in our research and academia more broadly. So it has been really nurturing to be able to work and organise alongside peers who don't just say the words, but live the words. If you are part of the RMIT community and are interested in joining our efforts, please contact us via email or Instagram. There are some flyers outside. Free Palestine. Free!
Thank you, everyone. The last bit of this of tonight, I would like to present our guests here, Professor Saree and Louise, two things, two gifts from Free Palestine Melbourne, a bag and a hoodie inside. Free Palestine Melbourne hoodie. I wish that Saree wear it in America. I will invite Dania, she's my daughter.